Are armed groups threatening conservation in Africa? Here to tell us is Steiner, the first law enforcement chief of African parks and now an independent consultant. Welcome, Kurt.
Thanks very much, Chris.
How many armed groups have settled in conservation areas in Africa that you know of?
It's difficult to say, but if we look at the Great Lakes region, we're looking at least 5 or 6 independent groups that have some sort of structure. And then further from that, we have bandit groups that are loosely formed and just seeking to extract whatever they can. So in total, between Central Africa, Northern and then Western Africa, I'd say we're looking at least probably 24 individual groups.
And how many armed battles are taking place in biodiversity hotspots in Africa that you know of?
Fixed battles would be very few. Most of those have occurred in Central Africa, mostly in DRC, with large groups of 12 to 24 or more. But almost on a daily basis, we're seeing small skirmishes where rangers will come across a smaller group, shots will be exchanged, the groups will either resolve that or break apart and flee contact. So easily on a weekly basis, I would say.
So once the groups are in these areas, what environmental crimes do they commit?
It's commonly thought that ivory is the main source of this, the main target that such groups are seeking, but it's not actually the case. Again, if we look at DRC, for an example, in the Virungas region, we're seeing up to $70 million a year being seized by these groups through the charcoal trade. So their activities are actually deforesting the old growth forests, converting it to charcoal and selling in community centres. So $70 million there versus a few thousand they may be getting from ivory. The main activities, I would say, are deforestation for charcoal, illegal mining, illegal fishing, and occupation of certain areas.
And what about the wildlife that's being killed to sustain them?
The wildlife is an opportunistic advantage gained by these groups. So with their presence in these areas, they're gaining safety, they're gaining distance from government forces that are searching for them. They're gaining food, water, shelter, all these sort of things. And they're also able to carry out their side activities such as taxation of illegal mining, taxation of fishing, and preying on local communities. That wildlife itself is being used for rations, as we've seen from almost every African conflict. The wildlife is shot out for rations to feed the troops, feed the militants themselves. And on top of that is just the opportunistic advantages. If you see an elephant, you have the rifles, you have the ammunition, you have the troops around you. You will shoot that elephant and then trade that ivory opportunistically. So it's not a systematic eradication per se, but more of an opportunistic threat on the wildlife.
Tell us more about these groups, their modus operandi.
It's so widely spread, but if we look at, say, Central Africa and DRC alone, we have May militias, which have been around for decades and have no strong political manifesto. They're simply preying on instability and using that to profit themselves. We can look at other groups such as FDLR, which broke away from Rwanda. Now they have a manifesto, and they're operating quite with strong organization. They have fundraising elements, they have budgets, they have different divisions within their organization. If we go further north, we have ADF and NALU, a more Islamist-backed insurgency coming out of Uganda. And again, fairly well organized. They have training plans, they have set camps, they have set structures and hierarchy. So it's a wide mix between ad hoc groups simply benefiting from instability, seeking to profit where they can, all the way up to those that have quite a strong military hierarchy and structure.
In your experience, which group is the most organized, the most successful, if I can use that word?
I would say FDLR in DRC is proving to be quite resilient. Their numbers have gone from 1,000 down to a few hundred and are coming back up again. And they have fundraising elements within each battalion and within each subdivision of their units. They must seek to gain funds to propagate their own activities, purchase arms and ammunition. Certain amounts, percentages, have to be sent back to headquarters. And we have groups like the National Salvation Front in South Sudan that has their own webpage and crowdfunding campaigns. So with all of those in mind, we've been going for quite a while. M23 has proven to be one of the most successful. We recall a few years ago, they managed to capture Goma, and it was quite disciplined and quite organized attacks. So those three, I would say, are probably some of the most organized, but all of them exist within their own space. So they may not require the organizational structure of a full military element. They have their personnel, they have their training regimes, they have their own methods of dispersing funds and profiting from it. So all of them are organized to some degree. That's how they would compare to what we think of as a rebellion, where they differ.
Now, once these groups enter conservation areas, are they pursued by the militaries of different countries, or is it left to law enforcement officers working in conservation to do battle with them?
We have seen over the years, especially in the last decade or so, that military and government attempts to curtail these groups and to limit them and to outright take them out have met with very, very limited success. I think you all recall the anti-LRA missions from about a decade ago. Lots of effort, lots of resources, multiple nations were coming in to try and cut them back. They ended up regrouping further south and avoiding all attack. We're seeing the same thing in the eastern DRC currently, where FARDC, local DRC military, has withdrawn from that area and been pushed back in a number of cases. It's difficult to say with any clarity what is actually happening there. And in those cases, it's often the conservation staff themselves that feel the brunt of it. They can't leave the area unless they abandon all efforts there. They're not there to engage with such elements and such insurgents. However, by default, they're in these areas and often come across them.
So, is there a situation that you have law enforcement, conservation officials having to do battle with highly trained militias and terrorists and organized crime syndicate members? Surely, how equipped are they to do that?
They're not equipped whatsoever, and it's not their mandate. Conservation law enforcement is, as the name suggests, a domestic policing task. It's not a military task. What they do have is equipment proportional to the threat they're going to face. However, it's not being escalated to the degree. We're not seeing rangers in armoured personnel carriers. We're not seeing them with indirect fire support weapons, such as mortars or artillery. That is not their role. So if we can use West Africa as an example, we're seeing rangers. We had 8 rangers a few years ago killed by improvised explosive devices. We've seen tourists attacked, killed, kidnapped, and trafficked further north. These are the threats that are being faced, but it's not their role to face. By the sheer fact that they're in these areas, they are confronting these elements.
How do they get treated by these armed groups when they run into them? Does it always end in a battle and bloodshed?
It can, in some cases. That's hopefully avoided. In the Kivus, we saw a case when M23 first came through about a decade ago. A negotiation, a truce was arranged around the guerrilla habitats in the mountains, where the conservation staff were seen as completely impartial and apolitical. They were explaining to the insurgents that we're not here for you or against you. We're not here for the government or against the government. We're here for conservation. And that truce was by and large respected. Rebels in the area did not touch the guerrilla sanctuaries after the first initial few killings. In other areas, we're seeing that they are being attacked. The first hope is to withdraw from such an overwhelming force. They're not there to engage in pitched battles. They're there to enforce the law. But where that's not possible, unfortunately, they have to do the best they can to protect themselves and those it is their duty to protect.
What training is being given to law enforcement officers in conservation to try and help them better deal with this?
Training actually has changed a huge amount over the last 10, 15 years. Where initially training may be, in many of these countries, equivalent to 3 weeks perhaps of just basic first aid, rank and hierarchy, conservation rules and such. Government forces, government institutions would often step in and conduct a number of months training, but the effectiveness was perhaps questionable. What we're seeing in the last 10 years is training. A basic field ranger course is between 8 and 12 weeks in length and concentrating predominantly on bushcraft and skills out in the field, human rights and the laws of the nation that they are upholding, first aid, communications procedures. It's quite extensive, and while it is based in the bush, has a very, very strong domestic policing mandate to it.
So, what are the biggest challenges that they face? I think I've read that they get threatened, bombed, tell us what they experience.
I think one of the hardest challenges that is faced is the lack of resources. We have some parks that have fantastic resources. The men have equipment and boots and vehicles and rations and housing. They're wonderfully looked after, but those are by far in the minimum. The majority struggle with very, very basic equipment, and that has a flow-on effect towards their health and well-being. We're seeing lots of gastro complaints, lost man days due to health problems and issues that could be easily preventable. So while there are a few that do have the resources they require, it's still in the minimum. And there are far, far more that do not have that. That's one of the biggest challenges, I think, being faced. On top of that, we have the logistical challenges in these areas. They are, by their nature, extremely remote. Vehicle movement is very difficult. If there is a medical evacuation necessary, it can take days or even up to a week or two to get to that area if they can't walk themselves out. We know of parts where there's not a single road within the entire protected area. So logistical difficulties in resupplying, deploying guys, recovering them when necessary, all of these add to the big challenges centered on a ranger's life.
So is it difficult to recruit people to work in the conservation industry in a law enforcement manner?
Not at all. I think part of that is due to historically low employment figures in many, many countries. A standard recruitment drive within a park would start with a pre-selection, where you want to get the best possible candidates to then go on to a selection. And in every single community centre where you hold a pre-selection, you may have up to 1,000 candidates applying for 10 single positions. And this is seen pretty much across the continent. There is a huge drive because the projects that are supporting these protected areas, that are conducting this training, that is your best chance as a local to get good healthcare, good equipment, a solid standard wage. If we look at Central African Republic, the protected areas in that country are some of the largest salary-paying organizations and therefore tax-paying organizations in the nation. So there's a large drive. So recruitment is never an issue. In fact, it's more often the opposite is the problem, where we have far more people applying for jobs than are actually available.
But are there funds available to train enough people to do the job the way you'd like to see it done?
That is always a difficulty, and I think on two counts as well. Struggling to find the funds to conduct proper and appropriate training. We have a duty of care to the rangers themselves. They can't be sent out without the training required to give them the best possible chance of success. That is a huge, huge problem, trying to find that money. In the past, it's been quite easy to find funds in certain projects for sexy items, for silver bullet items, such as drones. That's been a big thing for many years. Finding funds to get the guys enough socks and medical supplies, that's a bit more difficult. And the other second difficulty of that is training guys when a salary can't be guaranteed. We've seen in some cases where funding has been available to train rangers, and at the end of a program, you might have 200 trained law enforcement officers, yet there aren't the funds to actually continue their salaries and their employment, so they're let go. Now, what you have is a couple of hundred guys that know the bush, have been taught the skills, and actually have no job. So what are they going to turn to?
So who do you have to rely on for funding? Do the governments in the respective areas help, or do you have to go with a begging bowl to the outside world?
It's a little of both. In almost every wildlife department, there is a salary for rangers. However, it is rather low. It's judged by national standards. And it's also very hard to tell a country that you should prioritise this more when you actually have problems with healthcare, education, transport. There's a whole range of issues that need to be sorted. So in those environments, conservation often is left at the bottom of the priority list. So in these areas, rangers are given a salary, and beyond that, they're topped up with a per diem for days of work, or they're given extra benefits by external organisations and NGOs.
How many of them have been killed since records began?
So records first started to be accurately and more comprehensively collated from about 2006. Worldwide, we're seeing about 2,300 rangers have been killed since that period, of which about half of that is within Africa. So we're seeing it. US State Department, for example, calls it one of the most dangerous jobs that can be had.
And in which area have most of them been slain?
So within Africa, we're seeing the vast majority of that happening within Central Africa. So whether it's Central African Republic, a lot of casualties, DRC probably tops the list there. But across all these countries, we're seeing multiple homicides every single year. The nature of the law enforcement work is Obviously different from an urban area where in the bush, the most people you confront are armed. And for them, there's very little consequences, very little risk in taking shots against a ranger. If you kill them, then there's a very good chance you'll get away with it. So people are prepared to take their chances. Criminals will attack and they will fire in the hope of getting away.
Yes, I was just going to say there's probably no risk to them of arrest and a successful prosecution.
Very, very little risk whatsoever. So that's obviously aided to the attractiveness. The likelihood of getting caught is so low, you might as well take your chances, try and kill some rangers, and you might get away with it. You've got a very good chance of getting away with it, at least historically.
So how big is this threat to conservation in Africa generally?
Generally, it's the larger threat, I would say, is population growth and resource extraction from these areas. This is aided by the instability experienced in these parks, which is fueled by these armed militants and insurgents. When they come into an area, it's very little chance of actually enforcing domestic laws and increasing some level of stability. Lower-level guys who are coming into a park and maybe snaring some animals, that's really nobody's priority. No one really cares too much about that. The impact is far too low. It's when it becomes commercial and it becomes systematic and professionalized that an entire park can be depleted. And we're seeing this across swathes of West Africa. That is the great concern that we have.
An entire park depleted.
And we've seen that in many parts of West Africa where the overpopulation, once the animals have been taken care of, once they've been poached out, then the next stage is agricultural development, and this is empty land. Without the animals there seems to be little reason to protect it and keep it intact. And then agricultural and farming will move in, and once that happens, more deforestation happens. Population and residents within that protected area grows and becomes established. And at that stage, it's very, very difficult to say to families, you must move out. There's no point to that anymore.
So a whole park can be lost in this way?
Again, it's a multi-year process, but many of the projects that we're seeing are trying to halt that in the meantime, where they're seeing degradation. They try to come in, restock a park with game. They're trying to work with communities, finding what is it that you want? What do you need? Let us help find that for you. Let's help this with a shared plan for resource extraction. And once that approach has been taken, that park now has added credibility. It's seen credible in the eyes of the local populace. It's a joint project. It can't be done by imposition of laws. It must be done with the consent of the local populace. Where that happens, it can be turned around. And we're seeing that in parks such as Punjari and in West Africa and Benin, where despite all the difficulties, managing to restock and hopefully increase that wildlife population then has the flow-on effects and benefits.
So how can this be combated? What advice do you give governments at the mercy of armed gangs destroying its natural habitat?
A very broad question and a very important one, I would say, but possibly in my view would be three elements to that. And number one is probably the same issue that so many other problems in Africa are due to, which is corruption. We're seeing a lack of resources. We're seeing resources be diverted elsewhere and embezzled. Corruption, if that could be handled, if these parks could gain strong government support, that would be probably the largest problem whatsoever taken care of. Second to that would be professionalization. We're seeing lots of rangers that struggle with understanding what the laws are, what is a crime and what is not a crime. And further to that is understanding their mandate. They are there to enforce the laws of their nation, and which I think leads on to the third part is credibility. It must be done with the buy-in of local populations and communities. Without that, there's zero credibility and zero support, and the project is pretty much finished before it even got off the ground.
Thank you. That was Kurt Steiner, the former head of law enforcement for African parks and now an independent consultant, talking to us about armed groups threatening conservation in Africa. Thank you, Kurt.
Thanks very much, Chris.